Welcome to the Forward Together webinar series, brought to you by the School of Management at California Lutheran University. The series is designed to bring interesting topics and people to our global community of students, alumni, and leaders in business and government to empower, educate, and inspire. Forward Together features experts from industry with the purpose to spark thought, connect people, and stimulate engaging discussions. Please submit your questions in the chat. We will hold a Q&A immediately following the presentation.
Thank you, and welcome to this week's Forward Together. My name is Mike Panessis, and I'm the Executive Director of CalLutheran Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, housed in the School of Management. If our announcer's voice sounds familiar, you may listen to Mark Sylvester's podcasts. Mark is a friend of the School of Management in CalLutheran and an awesome serial entrepreneur in his own right. Mark hosts two podcasts, 805 Conversations, where he interviews prominent business people in the 805, and Hacking the Red Circle, which is a guide to giving TED Talks. Mark actually was an attendee at the very first TED conference and is one of the foremost authorities on giving TED Talks, along with his wife, Kimberly. You can find both podcasts at your favorite podcast provider. Some quick notes about this Zoom webinar. It's a view and listen only event. You have no camera or microphone control. If you would like to communicate with us or ask a question of the speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll remind you about that later in the presentation as well. The speakers may answer some of the questions during their talk. We'll also set aside some time for Q&A after the presentation. We'll also publish a link to the presentation slides and some additional resources, and we'll let you know when those are available. You may have noticed the I in the center's name. That's new. We've decided to expand the scope of what we teach and practice to include innovation. Entrepreneurship still is at the heart of the center, but innovation is an important enough part of what we do that it deserves equal billing. That I is the topic of today's talk. During a crisis, innovation is seemingly the last thing on your mind. You're worried about your health, safety, and security, and that of your friends and loved ones. However, history tells us that human nature rises to the occasion. We see the good when evil surrounds us and the path to a better life despite obstacles. Today we face two crises. One seemingly came out of nowhere in a matter of days, sending us all to shelter in place for months. The other has been with us for centuries, but now, finally, has the broad support for effecting and meaningful and lasting change. Here to speak to us today about innovation in a time of crisis are Marianne Amato and Larry Clark of Harvard Business Publishing Corporate Learning. Marianne and Larry are experts in this field, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. Your job, audience, for the next hour is to listen, ask questions, and think about how you can help us innovate our way to a healthier, better world. Marianne and Larry, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. And hello, everyone. I see we've got about 87 people online today already, and we're going to try to make this, even though you don't have cameras and microphones, make this as interactive as possible. So as Mike had said, you can chat in through the question and answer, not just questions for us, but thoughts, comments, things that come into your head as we talk about this, and we'll try to respond to that as we go through. As Mike said, I'm Larry Clark, Managing Director of Global Learning Services for Harvard Business Publishing, and I'm here with my wonderful friend and colleague, Marianne Amato, who is our Director of Global Organizational Effectiveness. Before we jump into our session, we get a lot of questions about who Harvard Business Publishing actually is. We are a nonprofit, wholly owned subsidiary of Harvard Business School. So many of you know us from our publications like Harvard Business Review and HBR Press, but we're also responsible for working with corporations and organizations around the world in developing their leaders. And perhaps at no time in history has leadership been more important. So, which brings us, of course, to our discussion today, which is leadership and innovation in a time of crisis. So let me pull up our slides. And how about, what do you say, Marianne? Shall we get started? Marianne, I think you're muted. All right. Yep, you're there now.
Oh, okay. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I'm greeting you from New York, and Larry is in Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to start us off with talking about some of the crises that we're facing right now. And I think Mike did a great job in explaining a couple of them. I would actually say there might even be more crises, right? So obviously we have the health crisis. Here in New York, we're not even in phase 1 of the reopen. So we have a long way to go. And I know everyone else is in various stages of reopening. And so we have a lot of fallout from the health crisis. But we have also an economic crisis as well that's coming out of that. And sitting on top of that, financial loss, health loss, lives lost, skyrocketing unemployment, we're sitting on top of a volcano that has been erupting for centuries and has recently taken center stage again as the latest crisis, and that is the racial injustice highlighted by the killing of George Floyd and countless others. So we have a lot of the stress and angst in our system, in our ecosystems right now. And through all of this, I hope that you are well, safe, and healthy. And ready to talk a little bit about a hopeful outcome out of all of this. So we're here to talk about the good that can come out of the bad, the silver lining, and talk about the drivers of innovation during a crisis and how we can continue that innovation after and beyond the crunch period. We're planning to share a little bit of thought leadership, some personal examples, and hopefully end with you being able to leave the session with some ideas that you could take back to your workplace. We don't have all the answers. You could literally spend a lifetime on any one of these topics that we're going to be covering, and many people have. So today we're just going to touch on some of the key ones. And I know there's a wide range of people on the line with many different backgrounds and talents, and we really want you, we want to learn from you just as much as you want to learn from us. So please use the chat. I liked the intro there that said, this organization sparks thought. So let's do that. Let's spark some thought. Okay, so before we begin for real, I'd like to take a quick moment and remind ourselves of the lie that is multitasking. So we know that it doesn't work. So if you can, center yourself and shut your phone off and the notifications, and let's get going. So Larry, do you want to flip the slide there? Yes. So what we did was we did a little research for this meeting and pulled together a word cloud that was simply around the COVID pandemic, because it was done before some of the recent actions that have been taking place. So right now, all you see are the words that are around the pandemic. And if we did it now, it would be totally different. But let's take a look at here and just take a perusal of all the words, and then look at that little one in the center there. It's the possibilities. So, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to say what is overlooked in the course of a crisis that we could actually highlight and spend some intentional time thinking about that in our job. So with that, today we're going to take us through, Larry's gonna start and kick us off with some of the conditions around which innovation, that can unleash some innovation in organizations. And then I'm gonna take us through some ways that we can lead innovation and continue that innovation beyond the crisis. And then we're gonna share some thoughts that you might wanna take away with, and we can have some interactivity. So that's our agenda today, and over to you, Larry.
All right, thanks, Marianne.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we thought would be helpful is to take a look back at prior crises to see what kinds of things have been born out of crisis in the past. And there are a number of them if you track through history. So the plague that happened in Europe and in Asia, actually, in the middle 1300s was not something that is usually associated with innovation. But a number of things came out of it that were surprising. Hospitals were born in that time. Medical medical help to the community was not provided through a hospital system prior to that, but as you can imagine what was going on with the plague, it had to be done en masse. So, but perfume also came out of that. Mechanical clocks came out of that time period. Eyeglasses came out of that time period. So these things were born out not necessarily directly attached to addressing the problem of the crisis, but they came out because of conditions that were created, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. I'm wondering if the Q&A is actually working. So I want to see if there's anybody that's got any ideas as to what are some of the things that might have come out of the Great Depression in terms of an innovation. Just chat into the Q&A. Somebody chat something just so I know that the chat is actually even working. There we go. Bank regulations.
Nice.
Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Job training.
Sliced bread. That's a good one.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Hello to you as well. So these were some of the things that came out during that time. And the Great Depression actually was over a number of years. So it wasn't just 29 to 31. Actually, we didn't get out of it until World War II started. But xerography, the ability to copy, supermarkets, a restructuring of how food is distributed in the US, neoprene, nylon. World War II.
By the way, Maria got that right. She said nylon. That was good.
Nylon. Awesome. And I'm wondering if she was out on the internet looking for that, or if she's just an expert in synthetic materials. So if we look at World War II, penicillin was born out of the World War II time frame. The microwave oven, which was based on research that was being done by the military, similar research that led to the radar. Duct tape was actually an invention by the mother of a sailor who was concerned about the time it was taking, when she had heard from her son about the time it would take to open boxes of ammunition on ships. And that time that was wasted doing that, they could be killed. So it was a fast way of doing that. So duct tape was born out of World War II. As you can see from the guitars in the background, I'm a musician, and in the music industry, duct tape pretty much holds everything together, and it probably does in a few others as well. But for 9/11, I mean, if you think about that time frame, a number of other things came out of that were unexpected. A number of things that were experimental, infrastructure, economic safety nets, a lot of stuff coming through now. Excellent, thank you. Keep the chat going as we go through this. Robots that were used in the recovery were pulled out of labs from ARPA. So things that had never been tried started being tried, and that led to a whole series of robotic advances. Crowdsourced journalism. Remember, this is long before we had iPhones or anything like that. So the concept of crowdsourcing information and journalism being based on that, and a number of things around advanced translation software related to the Patriot Act, and a number of things that had to go on to start tracking real time what people were saying in many different languages. So different kinds of innovations were born during a number of crises. Every crisis that occurs actually has innovation associated with it. So we need to understand why that happens. And speaking of the Depression, Joe Schumpeter, who had spoken about positive consequences of downturns, he's an economist from that time, and he listed a few things that were, again, going back to conditions that exist in a crisis. And this one, the destruction of underperforming companies. What does that do? That freed up capital from aging sectors that were becoming more and more irrelevant, and then redistributing that capital into new industries. And also the labor force changing completely. High quality, highly skilled workers shifting from one type of work to another, putting new focus on a bunch of other things. So as it said, for companies with cash and ideas, history shows downturns can provide enormous strategic opportunities. What we're going to talk about is how do you recognize where those opportunities are and capitalize on those. Now, one thing I do want to say as we get into this is what we're not saying here is, hey, bad things are happening. How can we be selfish and capitalize on those kinds of things? The kind of innovation that we're talking about is what Marianne was saying before. How do we make good things from bad? How do we take situations, leverage the conditions that exist to make the situation better? Now, it looks like we have a question. What is your opinion about entrepreneurial roles escalation in this crisis time slot? Is there any shift, change, or renovation? I'm not sure I completely understand the question in terms of roles escalation, but maybe Saba, if you can chat in any clarification on that while we're going, we can process that with you as we go through. All right, so let's get into it. And the next slide really gets us into what those drivers are. Now, what prompted us to have this was I had written a blog post and published it harvardbusiness.org called Innovation in a Time of Crisis, based on research our organization had done. And we found that there were 4 different things that conditions that arise that allow for innovation to happen. So as Marianne said, I'll be talking a little bit about what those conditions are and what's the opportunity in each one of them. And then I'll be handing it back to Marianne to talk about what you do with those opportunities and how you move forward. So the first one is uniting around a purpose. The second is how you see systems differently. Third is unfreezing the organization. And fourth is creating an action bias. So let's take a look at this first one, uniting around a purpose. So what does this mean in terms of the condition? What happens is a new reality focuses everybody's attention on a single inescapable priority. And usually that priority is external to them. So much time we're folded in on ourselves trying to get this done and get that done, and that guy that bugs me, and I have to move this, whatever forward. When you've got a situation where a new reality, everybody has to look at that instead. So the opportunity here is everyone's got a common enemy. The focus shifts off the external and you get this organizational energy spike. So as you could see, we all saw with the pandemic, manufacturing organizations, many of them shifted their entire product lines because there was a new purpose. The purpose for many of them was this issue around ventilators. So how do we actually address that? So this is how disparate people that don't really connect with each other or don't care to, all of a sudden have a reason to. And Marianne's going to talk a little bit more about what you do with that. But that's our first condition. Second condition is how systems appear. We start to see things through different lenses. It's like moving all the furniture around in your house, because everything starts to look different, and brokenness and vulnerabilities in the system suddenly just bubble up to the top. Like, why do we do it this way? How does this make sense to keep going this way? So what's the opportunity that the systems piece provides for us? First of all, your blinders are removed, right? The things that you couldn't see before, all of a sudden you can see, or you can see in a different light. Also, entrenched paradigms. So the assumptions that people have that underlie their thinking, well, it's always been like this, or, well, this is the best way to do it, or I've seen this problem 3 times before and I always solved it this way. That all gets wiped away because the system itself appears different. And then what's hidden about how people make sense about how things work all of a sudden goes from implicit to explicit, because everything gets questioned. Why do we have to do it this way? Why did we ever do it this way? Because now in this new light, it doesn't seem like it ever made sense. So one good example of this would be after 9/11, TSA security post 9/11. If you think about it now, and you think about the fact that on a plane, any passenger could have walked into the cockpit prior to 9/11. It wasn't difficult to access a cockpit. And then post 9/11, you look at that and you say, I can't imagine being in a system where I could just walk into the cockpit because we have a whole different perspective on how it works. So that's what we're talking about in terms of seeing the system differently. So we get into our third, it's this really interesting quality of organizations that they become unfrozen, they become fluid again. So all the hardened structures, everybody starts to see them as barriers to a solution, as opposed to this is the way we get things done. Guardrails are no longer guardrails, they're actually barriers. So they need to be removed. So the opportunity for leaders and innovators is to say, we've got a window to break through all this structural and policy stuff that exists, that's holding us back. And the focus shifts away from compliance to outcomes. It's not about, I've told you to do this, so you have to do it this way. Nobody cares about what we said before because the conditions are so different. So now everyone starts focusing on outcomes. So it's not just about the process changes that happen here. It's about the power base shifts. So like an example of this, we've heard about the defunding of police forces in certain cities. That's being challenged. The power base prior to George Floyd's murder was much more frozen. But now that this had happened, that unfroze a number of things and power has shifted. You think about the diversity function in a lot of large organizations. They don't have a lot of power. Right now, that power base is completely shifted. So they're able to move. So there's this window of opportunity because everything's more fluid. Marianne, were you going to say something there?
I was going to say something, yeah, that this could be related to the entrepreneurial structure and roles in a situation like this, where they may have had these barriers and now those barriers are more fluid. So I'm not sure if that was the question that was before, but I'm making a connection there. It might be something. So if Saba, if this is resonating with you, just chat in.
Yeah. Another example on this one that I used in the blog post actually is around grocery store supply chains. When the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden in Philadelphia, there was no toilet paper to be found anywhere. I don't know why, because the actual demand for the usage of toilet paper didn't change a bit, but suddenly everybody seemed to need it. So hoarding began, and that started changing the need to move supply of toilet paper differently. And supply chains have been set up with much smaller, over time, just kind of tuned and honed to have just-in-time supply in small warehouses and those kinds of things. And that just blew up, and buyers were just calling sellers directly, sending trucks directly, bypassing warehouses. All of a sudden, nobody cared. It was just about getting stuff to the stores because the stores were empty. So that's another example of how the organization can unfreeze. All right, and last one before I hand it off to Marianne is a bias toward action. So all of these things tie together, all of these conditions tie together to this one, that the problem to be solved requires deep and immediate response. You think about the pandemic, you can't waste time. So what happens, and this is a really important one for entrepreneurs and innovators, is that this intense study of the obvious becomes very apparent. It's like, we just don't have time. We don't have time for consensus. We don't have time to study this. We have to be willing to try things that may fail. And when we fail fast and move on. So it's a shift more to emergent thinking because of this bias toward action. So from a leader's perspective, you have to shift your thinking away from, hey, I'm running this plan over a period of time and I just have to manage to it, to more like a sports coach would have to do with her team, just to say, hey, I'm going to run this play and see how they react, and I'm going to run another play and that didn't work out so well, so I'm going to shift my strategy and just see how the game emerges. It's a very, very different way to think and lead, which is very discomforting for a lot of managers that are stuck in a control mindset. But this bias toward action just speeds everything up. The innovation cycle speeds up. It looks like we have a question here. We have a political question.
We have a political question. And so Luke, my comment there is that as we go through and talk about some of the things that we could do to continue innovation after a crisis, we'll shed light on whether, and we could all come back to it and say, hey, what do we think? How this current administration is tackling the crisis at hand, given the kinds of things that we're saying the changes in leadership need to happen. I'm pretty sure I know where I come out, but we'll take a poll at the end.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks.
Okay.
So what do you do about all these? You've got all these conditions and you've got all these opportunities. So Marianne, why don't you talk a little bit about how we actually address this?
Sure. So just flip to the next slide if you don't mind, Larry.
Sure.
So what we did is we took the 4 conditions and we said, okay, what do we really need to do as leaders and as innovators to sustain this innovation? So the first thing is, let me start with purpose. How do you sustain purpose? So during a crisis, we have all that energy, we have that common goal. So what do you do when that's not the case? when everyone isn't commiserating about how they haven't had a haircut in 3 months. By the way, I haven't had a haircut in 3 months. Yesterday was a really fortunate day for us because, for all of us, because we at Harvard had the opportunity to speak with John Coleman, who wrote the book on passion and purpose. And we were talking about this very topic. And I wanted to highlight a couple of things out of that. It is astounding at how few people feel a very strong sense of purpose in their work lives. It's 25% that agree with that statement, and only 15% feel engaged in their work. I feel like that's astoundingly poor. And one of the problems with it is because people try to think of purpose as something that they go out and find. You know, I'm going to hike up Kilimanjaro and I'm going to find my real true purpose. You know, they feel like they have to live like Mother Teresa, which would be good, but you don't have to, because really the issue is that you can create it in your own job. And as leaders, we can help other people find it in theirs. And one of the quotes that I really loved John saying yesterday was, purpose is not magic. It's willful, thoughtful, and intentional. It isn't found, it's made. So let's talk about some ways we could create it. I don't have time to go through every one, so I'm gonna just pick and choose. So to build greater purpose, you can craft your work in ways that you find most meaningful and focus more time and energy on those. By way of example, this kind of presentation is something that I find meaningful to do. I came from a long history in consulting, and then I took a job internal to Harvard. And I spend my days focusing on how we build the skills and abilities and our talent in our current company. But it really excites me to make sure I have a connection with what's happening in the world, is talking to new people and understanding what's going on in their lives and their work lives. So I truly enjoy things like this. So when I have an opportunity, I take that to craft this and these kinds of things as bigger pieces of my work. As leaders, we need to ask ourselves, how can we give our teams the freedom to craft their own jobs? Because when they do, the energy returns, the engagement increases, and their passions can lead to further innovation. So I don't know where these kinds of talks go, but they can go someplace. You know, Larry and I can do these other places. We can push our company to maybe create content around this and drive innovation inside. So how often do we give our teams, and even ask our team members, what is the most meaningful part of your job? It's a start, build from there. The second one that I'd like to focus on is invest in positive relationships. And this is super important, and it's stuff we already know, right? Be a mentor, be a mentee. Make sure that you have work-life balance. Most of our purpose comes from our families, our partners, and obviously devote time to those. But there's a piece of investing in positive relationships that I want to highlight, and that's pursue new and diverse relationships. I want to tell you a story about just a couple of weeks ago. I was in an extended team meeting. So we have a team meeting every week, and this week additional people joined. And I was just talking about, you know, what should our response be to all this racial unrest? And we should have a cohesive response to our populace. And we were talking about it, and afterwards, one of those people who were not normally in the meeting, but were in the extended meeting, that woman called me. She's a Black woman, and I know her for a couple of years, but not very well. And we decided that this issue was important enough to both of us to invest more time into it and into each other to affect the change in our organization, to take the opportunity and switch the power. As the power structure shifted, we could actually make good. And now we are down the road a little bit and finding tremendous purpose from that. And the moral of the story here is, it was because she pursued a new and diverse relationship with me, and that we found purpose, and that unleashed innovative and forward thinking that our organization probably would not have done without it. Okay, so chat in. Thank you, Julia. All right, so now we're going to move to condition 2, and you could always chat in, and we could always come back. So condition 2 is systems, right? And Larry was saying that during a crisis, the vulnerabilities of the system in which we work and live are so easily seen, right? But after it's over, how quickly do we go to saying, let's go back to normal? I hear it every day. I can't wait for till this is over so we can go back to normal. But that's not where we want to go, right? I mean, we've already seen the cracks in the system. We address them with agility and speed, and we want to continue that. So how do we keep that up? And to be honest, it's hard. It's hard to do without forcing ourselves. So we have to intentionally test our assumptions. We very recently did a survey of about 50 CEOs and talked to them about the effects that the COVID crisis had on their business and on their leadership. And many of them said it allowed them to rethink everything. Like, it gave them an opportunity to simply look at a problem in a different way. And what this means to me is that we all operate with underlying assumptions. And if we want to sustain that innovation during a non-crisis time, we have to stop believing everything we think. And I know that sounds facetious, but it really does help to make sure that we're surfacing those assumptions. Of course, we have to make assumptions. You have to in your roles, but surface them so we can see them and test them and make sure that they're actually working. And there's tons of ways, and a lot of them are on the screen. There's tons of ways that you could do that, right? You could do the 5 whys technique. You can do hypothesis testing. You can delve into your deeply rooted mindsets, a la immunity to change. All fantastic ways of making sure that you're seeing the system that you're in clearly. And I want to tell you a little story about my own assumptions lately, and what I've been learning. And this is totally a personal story, and it's my personal journey. And I'm not presuming to be an expert on this at all. But I have been trying to surface these assumptions in myself and evolve. So I've begun to speak more and more to my Black friends and other people of color about their experiences. And one of the assumptions that I've always had about myself is that I'm not racist. I was okay with that. I think that's a moral imperative, and I wanted to have that as the forefront of my character. And I think that's the way people should be. And then I started reading, and reading about, one of my friends said to read a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it's from, I just have to look at my phone to remember the name, Ibram Kendi, and I recommend it. Anyway, he posits that there's a continuum, and the continuum is that you test the policies and actions and thoughts against this continuum of supporting racial equity or supporting racial inequity. And the continuum is really blew my mind, because if you reframe yourself into that, you can see that there really isn't a space, that comfortable space anymore to say, I'm not racist, because it's, are you supporting racial equity or are you supporting racial inequity? So it removed that comfortable space anymore, and it challenged my assumptions. And I now am, thinking about that new lens, and having that new lens, allowing it to drive me to think different and new thoughts. So that was one thing. Yeah, me too, Timothy. And another assumption that I had was, and I found this out by asking questions about how my Black friends were doing, like how they were coping. And another assumption that surfaced for me was, I thought that they would too be horrified and outraged and angry, just as I was, and that we could have that conversation and put it over here, and then get back to, oh my God, there's a big presentation that needs to be done tomorrow, and this thing needs to be done yesterday, and we have to, make sure you worry about the kids and your parents and all of the things that are normal in life. And what I found when I started to talk to folks is that that wasn't the case. My reality wasn't theirs. They had some of these folks had tough time focusing. And these were folks with great families and great jobs and all of that. So I say this to you because our assumptions about what's going on are not always visible. So I want to highlight that if we are open to challenging our assumptions, the opportunities to do so are all around us. And it can be as easy as asking people how they are and how they're coping. And Bell, the 5 whys is just going down, like starting with the problem and saying, why did this happen? And then whatever your answer is, it's why did that happen? And do that consecutively 5 times until you actually get to the root cause. So it's just a technique. So in order to test your assumptions, I would say be open, start with conversations, and use any one of these techniques on the screen. All right, let's move on to condition 3. Unfreezing. So crisis makes an organization more fluid, but how do we prevent those policies and barriers from just popping right back up and tamping down the innovation? And my answer to that is really, we have to really assume more collaboration because everyone has blind spots. And even if we think of teams or organizations, when we collaborate only with people who have similar life experiences, similar backgrounds, similar education, we are magnifying those blind spots, not eliminating them. Instead, we have to build collaborative networks with people with a variety of skills and backgrounds and life experiences. And you already know this because there's so many studies published on this. And David Rock had one in 2016. I'm sure there's many others, but they actually show how diverse and folks on teams with a wider range of educational work backgrounds create more innovation. So there's studies to support that. So that's something we can attack right away. We want to keep those fluidity. We want to keep that fluidity. Make sure our teams are diverse. And beyond diverse teams, compassion is key. It's one of the most overlooked aspects around resilience that I see in terms of what really creates some and keeping that unfreezing in the organization. And in fact, it was one of the most salient themes to come out of our research with the CEOs that I referenced before. And it was that they want to continue to focus on compassion and empathy for employees moving forward, and that it was a critical component, not only during the crisis, but after. It was sort of like lead with be human first. And I highlighted a couple of quotes because I thought they were really good. This is from one of the CEOs. The best leaders that we have are those picking up on the individual variability in emotional well-being and partnering with each person to help them perform their best. Another one said, more empathy. People's normal isn't your normal. I'm now finding myself managing lonely people, managing people that have babies in the meetings on the Zoom calls. So empathy and empathy is important and critical. Here's another one. The need to demonstrate empathy, perceiving, using your intuition and listening, asking questions are essential to pull out of this crisis. So just a few things in terms of compassion and diverse teams as a way to keep that fluidity going. Okay, how amazing to hear CEOs put forward. I'm telling you, I was too. I was amazed by it. It came out as number 1. Okay, finally, we get to the last one, which is action bias. Again, crisis force action. Like we had, you had a 3-day face-to-face training session planned for Tuesday. Well, now you have to make it virtual, and you have only 4 days to do it. So, and you do it, right? So, okay. But after the crisis, how do you keep that action bias going? And part of what Larry said before is you have to think about having that experimental, that innovator mentality of experiment, fail fast, learn from your failures and move forward. In order to do that experimentation, people really need to bring themselves to work, their full selves. And in order for that to happen, they need to feel like they belong. So my advice is, in order to keep the action bias, focus on inclusion. And what you see here on this thing is wholly stolen from a brand new book that was just published last week called Unleashed: The Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You by Frances Fry and Jolie Morris. And I liked this inclusion dial because it speaks to a lot of the things that we were already talking about, right? And it helps us see that there's a continuum around how to do this. So the first one is safety, which is really just, are you physically and emotionally safe in how you and where you work? And I'm betting most of us have that already in our workplaces. But the second one is really, when you get to welcome, it's really around Amy Edmondson's ideas around psychological safety. So is there any penalty if I speak up, right? We all know the famous story about, the O-ring on the Challenger, and the person who knew about it kind of felt like she shouldn't say anything because there was a senior person in the room, and if they didn't know it, then what she had to say wasn't worth it. And so we can see that if people don't feel psychological safety, they won't speak up. Our experiments may fail, but it may take a lot longer to have them fail. So we won't have that bias to action as much as we need. So we need to have them feel welcome. And then we could get to the right half of the inclusion dial, where I think a lot of us feel challenged, which is really celebrating the differences. So we're rewarding you for those differences, for contributing your unique ideas and perspectives, as opposed to just making sure you feel okay to say something without repercussion. We move to celebrating. And then we move to full inclusion, where the whole organization is actually using that as a competitive advantage. And that's where we have people feeling they're bringing their full selves to work. So it might seem counterintuitive, but in order to keep innovation happening in terms of action bias, we should be focusing on inclusion tactics. And I see a question here. Would we need new ways to establish reliability and accountability? Yeah, I think so. I think we have to lean on our management. Well, first of all, we have to support them, but it is their jobs to be creating these conditions all across these four conditions, to make sure that we are continuing that innovative strategies across time.
Yeah, and I'd also added in a comment to Saba that we sometimes think it's either got to be structured or unstructured, and I think there are a lot more areas in the organization that can remain fluid. So where do we really need structure and compliance? Where if we have a looser structure, will people die, or the boss goes to jail, or something like that? Right. And where could we really live in a less uncomfortable, maybe more fluid environment because it can breed innovation? So that may be a good question for leaders to look at their organizations. Exactly.
And I see some comments coming in about vulnerability and trust, and I think those things go together. And so these are great points. I would also say, let's make sure we focus on the outcomes too, right? So, if we want to have inclusion, let's focus on some metrics that actually show us that we actually have an increasing inclusion. Let's test those experiments. Let's look at our engagement rates and things like that.
Yeah, some great comments coming in.
Yeah, I know. That's awesome.
So why don't we take it from where we go from here? Thank you, Marianne. So there are a number of there's different questions that we can start to ask ourselves, because what part of what we want to do is, as Marianne was saying, carry forward. Like we don't have to have a crisis for these kinds of conditions to exist in our organization. So what can we do first of all, what can we do in the current situation? Because we seem to have crises everywhere. But also, what can we do as these crises resolve to keep the conditions in the organization so so we can continue to innovate. So the first question, what's happening in your system that provides a window of opportunity for innovation? How can you shift people's perspectives and have them see the system different? That's the first one. Marianne, you want to talk to the second one?
Yeah, I want to challenge us to say, where is meaning and purpose sneaking up on you? And how can you mine it, right? We have all of this fluidity. We have this moment in time where the barriers are being pulled down. There might be a light shining in certain parts of the organization. How are we taking advantage and mining those opportunities to be innovative and push our organizations and ourselves further?
Mm-hmm. How do we, as you've been talking about, Marianne, also, how do we create more diversity in teams to minimize the blind spots? In a prior life, I worked for Comcast Corporation, and one of the things Comcast is known for in their service now is the voice remote, where you press that button and you can just speak into it, and it just brings up the show that you want. And one of the keys to that team was they had a very, very diverse a diverse team working on that. And they actually pulled together the story around that. And it was one of the things that we talked about in the organization, about how diversity of a team actually can be viewed as a practical thing, not a philosophical thing, but a practical thing that drives innovation in a new way. Because as we heard about the story, realized many of the things that had to lead up to make that simple blue button work required very different points of view, people challenging each other's blind spots, and real collaboration across a lot of boundaries to make it happen. You want to take the last one, Marianne?
Sure. How can you truly make inclusion a focus for your teams and get people around that inclusion dial? And I think there are things that we talked a little bit about today. It's, how do we even start the conversations about, what's most meaningful to you? What is maybe you're feeling, that you're not psychologically safe? How can we go down those roads and have those conversations so that we can leverage? The whole idea is to leverage folks' talent and bring that to the organization so we can generate new ideas and keep innovation up. So how can we do that in each of our teams?
All right. So with that, we do want to leave you with some additional resources. Marianne, thank you for pulling this together. I can take no credit for the list.
Anyone has a couple of hours or days to go through this.
Yeah, and we will make these slides available in a PDF format, as Mike had mentioned earlier. But these are some of the things that you can take a look at to build on some of the things that we've talked about today. And I think that is it for us. And with that, I want to turn it back to Mike.
Thank you very much, Marianne and Larry. I wish we could give you a round of applause. That was wonderful. We do have a few more minutes. If anyone wants to ask any more questions, please go ahead.
We are in the...
Lots of thank yous.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So I want to go back to Saba's question at the beginning. That one of the downsides of doing the Q&A this way is it's hard to have a conversation. My read of his question was, what's the role of entrepreneurs in a crisis, and how does that change? So I think we've seen I think about the COVID crisis, people became entrepreneurs, or at least behaved like entrepreneurs, who might normally would not. So we have an army of people sewing masks. We have engineers who are, I didn't realize there were so many ways to create a ventilator, but it seems like there's this activity that's super important when you're facing a crisis, to think about things differently. What do you think about that? About non-traditional entrepreneurs becoming entrepreneurs?
Yeah, sometimes we refer to them as intrapreneurs, inside organizations that suddenly they bubble up, and the ideas that they have, suddenly there's room for them. Suddenly they have a voice. And this happens, I've seen it in my own career with people who are introverts that don't feel necessarily like they're not necessarily going to jump up in a meeting and just react to everything that's going on in the moment, but they're thinking deeply about the problems. And when a crisis comes, they have a window of opportunity to be heard. And yeah, I think it creates a space for different people with different perspectives that may not have felt like they have a voice in the organization, to have a real voice. And that should be a lesson for all of us about how things should always be in an organization. People should feel they have a voice, and that gets back to what Marianne was saying about the psychological safety piece and everything. Marianne, did you have any other thoughts on that? I think you're muted at this point, but I think you're muted. No, you can't unmute.
You're muted, Marianne. Nope. Okay. Is that a whiteboard behind you?
She was write a big note and stick it in front of the camera.
There you go.
All right.
What else have we got in the window? From Peggy.
How do you break down the barrier of fear that can derail progress, for all of what you presented? This to me gets back to this concept of psychological safety, and it also to me gets back to the concept of well, we'll start with the psychological safety piece first. Is that I've always said, like, I've inherited teams in myself that have been somewhat broken, and had to reshape them and rebuild them and create safety where there wasn't much. And one of the things I've noticed is that you can create an environment of psychological safety where people feel safe, because people should be able to feel safe, but you can't necessarily make them feel safe. That's something that they have to do. It's like if you're afraid of flying, no matter how safe they make the airlines, you're still going to have to battle that fear. So I think leaders need to be able to create the environment where the plane is safe, but the passenger, the people in the organization, need to step up and say, I'm going to take a risk. And I think that's the key thing that has to happen, that it's the partnership of the two. Create an environment where you're encouraging people to bring things forward, where you're willing as a leader to show that, hey, I just made a mistake on this, and, or leaders asking different kinds of questions instead of saying, how did you screw this up, or what went wrong? You can say, what did we learn? What are we learning from this? How are we going to carry that forward? That kind of dialogue creates a very different environment.
So we have a couple more.
All right.
From Stacy, and then from Harry.
Stacy, do you have suggestions on how to mobilize senior leadership using these same strategies near lower level within an organization? It's, yeah, in a time of crisis, mobilizing senior leadership isn't that hard, and it breaks down lines of communication, break down barriers to communication. So it's not just horizontally that communication can happen more easily, it's vertically as well, because they need faster answers, and the hierarchy in an organization can create more problems with that. So there's more mobility of communications there. But in times when it's not, it's influence strategies. If leaders are creating an environment where people can feel safe to have the conversations, it's everyone's responsibility to understand that there's the hierarchy and the structure of an organization, and that there's also the network of the organization, the informal relationships, particularly indirect influence. So if you're in an organization, you want to influence the direction of something major that's under the control of a leader, and you don't have access to that leader, you probably have access to someone who has access to someone who has access to that leader. And it's using your informal network strategies. Marianne, are you no longer?
Yeah, I'm
voice
actually
now.
I fixed myself. And
Awesome.
I just wanted to add that that's what maybe as leaders, we can look for those places in the organization that it happens to be where the light is shining at the moment. Right now it's diversity, tomorrow it could be a different area, but help our folks who have those passions and purpose around that, lead them to that, lead them to those areas where there are places that they can influence more easily.
Mhm. Yep. And I love Harry's question, how can I tell if I'm the barrier to progress? I think you're well on your way, Harry.
Asking that question
Asking
is awesome.
that question, yeah. Ask it every single day. I ask
Right.
myself that all the time. I
So
recently went through an organizational change, and I kind of woke up with that thought many days in a row. Am I being a barrier to progress? Am I helping us or not? So,
Harry is a recently retired professor at Cal Lutheran, and I can say with certainty, Harry, you are not a barrier to progress because you always ask the question.
Yep.
Yep.
I could tell by, if you're asking that question, you're well on your way.
Yes.
mm-hmm. Yep.
So we've got one more from Saba, and then
Saba.
I think we'll stop it there. If there are any more questions, we'd be happy to forward them to you.
We'd be happy to also share with you our emails. If you wanted
absolutely.
to connect with us after the fact, you had other questions, we'd be happy to respond to those.
Yeah, and it was a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Well, thank you very much.
Ditto.
This was just wonderful. I know a lot of the people who were on the webinar. It was a really interesting, diverse group of people, and very much appreciate your time and your thoughts.
It's a joy. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. I know the Cal Lutheran folks have another webinar to go to in 3 minutes. So we wrapped up. Our timing's really good. Please join us for our next Forward Together webinar series entitled Responses to COVID-19 in Asia, Healthcare and Economy. And you can register at CalLutheran.edu/forward. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
We thank you for participating in today's Forward Together webinar series, brought to you by the School of Management at California Lutheran University. The School of Management offers a broad range of programs and community services. Whether you're looking to upgrade your career, locate current economic data from our Center for Economic Research and Forecasting, or a place to start and grow your business at Hub 101, our community startup space, we invite you to visit us at CLU.edu/SOM and join the community as we move forward together.